And staying with the growing refugee crisis around the world, the External Engagement Coordinator of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Fatoumata Lejeune-Kaba, joins me from Dakar, Senegal, via Zoom. Good to have you join us.
Thank you for having me.
We understand that there are a number of elements fueling this crisis. Talk to us about that and then the enormity of this crisis as well.
Well, let me start by the enormity of the crisis itself. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. And of course, behind each of these numbers, you have a lot of people, millions of people suffering because they had to leave their homes by no fault of theirs. This is because there's so much violence, a lot of human rights violations, all sorts of conflicts that could have been resolved peacefully. But now, with a number of factors, such as growing armed factions, competition over natural resources, we're seeing that conflicts that have been there for some decades or more are now turning so violent that people have no option but to leave their home. A lot of these people leaving are not necessarily crossing borders to go to neighboring countries. They're staying within their countries. We call them the internally displaced people, and they make the bulk of those fleeing. In terms of solutions, of course, there is no solution really, except that there's got to be peace. There's got to be political will to sit down around the table and wars, conflicts, whether they're localized or bigger.
Do we find that this crisis, I mean the refugee crisis, is also now compounded by a lack of humanitarian aid?
Yes, because we do all we can to assist whenever there is a new emergency, as we call it, whenever a new displacement takes place. But the problem is the scale of the displacement, even the rate of displacements in many parts of the world, like we've seen it with Ukraine, but less visible to many people, is what's happening, for example, across Africa or even the region that I cover, which is West and Central Africa. We can't keep up with the needs. It's just not possible. And each time there is a new crisis, it means that we have to all call on the same donors to provide help for money. And it doesn't just come overnight. It takes a lot of time to prepare. There are contracts to be signed. Basically, we can't keep up with these crises, despite everything we've been doing for a number of years. And if I bring it down to our areas, one of the fastest growing displacement crises in the world today is in the Sahel. So close to us in West Africa, where we have Burkina Faso, nearly every week, thousands of people get displaced.
And I agree with you that it's difficult to keep up because when you look at, you mentioned Africa, the issues around climate change, drought and all of that, and which is also now compounded by the issues of food prices. And then I know there was a time where UNHCR was also calling for help for refugees in the Yemen crisis. There is the Afghanistan crisis where UNHCR was also calling for help. And now UNHCR is calling for help for the Ukraine crisis. And there are issues of climate change as well. But talk to us about areas that need urgent help, urgent attention.
I get asked that question a lot. The problem is I can't yet give a straight answer because if you say shelter, then you're housing people who don't have food. If you say food, you're leaving people sleeping out in the open. So that puts them at risk of many things, including, diseases that will make the food situation or the nutritional state even worse. If you talk about, needing a place to have some agricultural activities, you need to negotiate land with the people that the lands belong to, because those who fled are no longer at home in their natural environments where they had what they needed to survive, to carry on about their lives. So everything is actually urgent, and that's why our call is for solutions for everybody to work together And here I'd like to make a call to the private sector, especially in Africa, where we're not doing enough as Africans to pull out weight to help. If we take Nigeria, for example, there are over 3 million people internally displaced inside Nigeria, a very rich country. But they're being helped, of course, by the governors in their areas, let's say the Northeast, for example. But it's really not enough when we see that there's enough wealth in the country for people to come and assist further because it's their own brothers from Nigeria. We also have refugees, of course, in some of the countries with a lot less wealth, for example, than in Nigeria. When we take Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, you have it. There's not enough response from nationals. Of course, there are some very, very generous people helping the refugees, but it's just far from enough because we keep relying on humanitarian agencies that themselves rely on donors who are the country's partners for development. But we know the limits of all this, so we need to do a lot more as communities that are welcoming, of course, to the refugees because the countries in Africa are quite generous. To be honest, if you see how much refugees outnumber the local population in the areas where they settle, or the internal displaced who have fled from their regions to go elsewhere, it's just an amazing gesture. But
Fatoumata, if
the
I may quickly
response,
jump in, I understand you're right that people are not doing enough. I don't know if it's because people are now numb because of the enormity of the crisis, or that people just don't care because, well, it hasn't happened to them. But I also understand, because you said earlier that there is no foolproof solution. But talk to us about the short-term action that we could take, whether as individuals, organizations, and communities.
well, there are many actions that can be taken when a new crisis happens, or even with the old ones. People can employ refugees, for example. They're not just vulnerable people with no skills waiting for humanitarian help. You have among them doctors, you have educated people, but they're not necessarily recruited because they're refugees. We want the governments to continue the efforts they're making to include refugees in the national development plans, even if it's local or regional. So the private sector can employ refugees. Some people can train them as well if they have institutions training. They can be included in sports activities. They have talent as artists. So there are a number of ways that people can help, of course.
We'll continue to shed light on this. It is an enormous crisis, and thanks to UNHCR for the work you're doing. And thanks for talking to us, External Engagement Coordinator for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Fatoumata Lejeune-Kaba.
Thank you very much.